wonderful last Tuesday of and I hope you're doing great this wonderful last Tuesday of June and the last Tuesday of Q2 2025. Welcome to Amoge Radio Communications and welcome to Driving Economic Growth with Innovation, the very last episode in this quarter, the very last episode of this program. It's been a joy, it's been a delight, it's been a pleasure, it's been a privilege doing this with you for this last 3 months, and we are very grateful for your continued listening. We are grateful for your support. We are grateful for your comments. We are grateful for your feedback. We are grateful for your following. We do not take it for granted at all. I'm very glad and delighted to be with you. My name is Tolu Omodara, welcoming you very warmly to this final edition of the program. Have you been? Have your families been? Hope you have been keeping safe. Hope you have been staying peaceful no matter what. Hope you have been keeping yourself calm, right? I hope you have also been focused as organizations and institutions and also nations on your goals at the level of the nation, at the level of the institution, at the level of the organization, right? This happens to be the very last Tuesday of the quarter, and it also happens to be the last Tuesday of half year 1, 2025. So it will soon be the time for your half year reviews if you've not started it already as we prepare to go into half year 2. Now, this is very important to today's edition of the program, which happens to be the last episode, like we said. Today, we are going to be putting it all together, right? We've been on this for the last 3 months, and today we'll be putting it all together in the closing episode titled Creating a Framework for DEGWI. DEGWI, by now, you know, is driving economic growth with innovation. Creating a framework for DEGWI, creating a framework for driving economic growth innovation, the performance management way. I repeat, creating a framework for DEGWI, creating a framework for driving economic growth innovation, the performance management way, right? We are going to be putting it all together because we think that this is a very good way to wrap up the program, to wrap up the quarter, to wrap up the episodes, to put it all together, right? Because it is very easy to speak and not do. And if you know us very well in Amogate, we are big on execution. We believe a lot in bridging the policy performance gap, and we believe strongly in bridging the strategy implementation gap. We know from experience, we know from research, we know from audits, we know from surveys that many times the strategies that organizations make, the policies that nations articulate often do not make it to the point of implementation. And we know that many times the gap needs to be bridged by certain frameworks, and that's what we'll be talking about today. But just before we do, as always, let me quickly do a wrap-up or a quick wrap-up of some of the points, the critical points made last week, right, on the last edition of the program, right? So let me do a quick highlight and we will flow from there into the thrust of today's program by the grace of God. Welcome again to this edition of the program. My name remains Tolu Omodara, warmly welcoming you to Driving Economic Growth and Innovation, the final edition. Now, last week we talked about the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth. It was part 2 of this conversation, and the sub-theme was doing the targeting. I repeat, last week we talked about the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals. It was part 2, and we're looking at doing the targeting, right? The previous week we had talked about the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth, right? But that was 2 weeks ago. But last week we specifically looked at the imperative of doing the targeting. Now, leadership, like we said last week, is a critical equalizer in the simultaneous equation. And I'll explain very quickly. There are 2 parts of this equation. There is economic growth and there is innovation, right? We talk about driving economic growth with innovation. On one part is innovation, on the other part of the equation is economic growth. Now, innovation must lead to economic growth. Innovation must be equal to economic growth. That equal to, however, that equalizer is leadership. It is leadership that will make innovation equal to economic growth. It is leadership that will ensure that the creative inventions in a nation, right, in different organizations of the nation accumulated, the cumulative effect of it is that it translates into economic growth. So effective leadership is a translator, right, that ensures that we appropriately and optimally translate inventiveness in a nation to economic growth. Inventiveness is one language, economic growth is another language. Inventiveness is often the language of sciences, natural and technical sciences, and economic growth is often the language of social sciences. Certain factors ensure that the translation is effectively achieved, and chief among those factors is leadership. So effective leadership is the translator that ensures that the language of innovation is effectively conveyed into the outcomes, the results, the impact of economic growth in a nation. That's why leadership has a responsibility for cognitive direction, and that cognitive direction often comes from data analysis, trends analysis. Overall, leadership has that responsibility, like we said last week, to think before it can see. I repeat, overall leadership has the accountability, right, to think. When thinking there comes from analysis, data analysis, strength analysis, comparative strength analysis, peer nations analysis, all kinds of analysis must proceed before eventually ensuring that the inventive activities translate into economic growth. Now, that cognitive direction would come from a clear vision, right, of how the leadership wants to synchronize inventive activities and economic growth. But it first begins with the thinking, like we said. You have to think before you see. It's after the thinking, the analysis, the trends analysis, the peer nations comparison, the data analysis, identifying the correlative activities. What did we do well here? What didn't we do well here? Why is this correlated with this? Why is this correlated with that? By the time all of that analysis has proceeded, it's then easier to translate into vision. Like, okay, from what I have reflected upon as a leader, as a president, as a prime minister, based on all the presentations from the different secretaries, from the different ministers, from the different, ministries and departments, based on all of their presentations, from what I can synchronize as the overall head, well, I would want to suggest that we proceed this way in order to ensure that we translate our inventive activities into economic growth. So once again, I want to say that cognitive direction is the responsibility of overall leadership, right? And from that cognitive direction will then come a clear vision, take note of the word clear, a clear vision of how leadership wants to synchronize innovation and economic growth. Now, the economic growth must be defined in the specifics of what exactly the nation is trying to target the innovation at. What exactly are we trying to target innovation at? Is it soft power? Is it hard power? Is it agricultural self-sufficiency? Because a nation that depends on another nation for all of its foods is not economically secure, right? Food is the foundation of the basic needs of human beings. Talk about food, clothing, and shelter, but food is the foundation. So a nation that is entirely dependent on other nations for its agricultural imports is not economically self-sufficient in the least. So sometimes you want to say we want to target our innovation at agricultural self-sufficiency, food self-sufficiency, right? Sometimes you want to try, and I can go on and on, but please, like I always say, you would do well to visit the previous edition of this program on Amoge Radio Communications on YouTube. Please subscribe to our page. We have about 300 videos on all kinds of programs. We've been doing this consistently for the past 3 years. You will find programs on strategy. You will find programs on geopolitics. You will find programs on driving economic growth with innovation is just one of them. You will find core issues in economic development, optimizing opportunities in the Ethiopian banking sector by my colleague Abiodun Abari. You will find programs on accelerating your career by Mr. Adeola Gbadebo. You will find programs on aligning educational reforms with national development. Very robust and rich streams of programs targeted at national, institutional, organizational development, which is our focus in Amoge's Communications Consult. So again, like I said, I cannot go over every single thing said last week, but that was the thrust, right? We're looking at driving economic growth innovation, which has been the theme. And last week, we began to talk about leadership being the equalizer. We started it 2 weeks ago, but we looked at last week we looked at leadership being the factor that that will not just synchronize the two parts of the equation, which is economic growth and innovation, but leadership would also do one thing, which lays the foundation for this week. So last week we said that one of the critical roles of leadership is to target performance goals at the level of ministries, right? Because the overall leadership of a nation, whether it's the presidency, whether it's the office of the prime minister, whether it's the office of the king, as it is in some nations, whatever the designation, the overall leadership of a nation has the responsibility for ensuring that all the inventive activities in the nation are translating into economic growth. Now, this overall leadership has accountability, like we said last week, but the responsibility is shared by those at the lower level of the leadership, at the next level of leadership. And those are essentially the ministers or the secretaries, as they are called in different nations. Some call it ministers in a country like Nigeria, some call it secretaries in a country like the United States, whatever the designation may be. Below the level of the presidency, below the level of the overall leadership, is a role that is also highly responsible. And one of the things we proposed last week, that as the one having overall accountability for synchronizing economic growth with innovation, the overall leadership should be ensuring that the synchronization is part of the performance indicators for the ministers and secretaries. I'll explain what I mean by that. So as a minister, as a secretary, if you give me a function, or if you give me goals, let me put it that way, you give me performance goals. Remember, we are looking at reviewing our half year as nations, as institutions, and so on and so forth. So if you give me a performance goal that is just focused on me, on my department, on my agency, on my ministry, I'm simply going to focus on that. But if as the overall leader, right, as a president, as a king, as a minister, as prime minister, you say to me that part of my KPIs, my key performance indicators, is to ensure, part of my key performance indicators is the level of synchronization I have with other ministries, other departments, and other agencies, then I would definitely be more incentivized to ensure that effective synchronization. I hope I'm making sense here. So I, as the overall leader, I, as a president, I, as a prime minister, I have oversight for all the ministries, departments, and agencies. Ultimately, if anything goes wrong in the nation, they may show your name as the prime minister, they may show your name as the king, they may show your name as the president, not the ministers. So you are the overall leader because you have oversight of all the ministries. You see all the dimensions, you have the helicopter vision to facilitate a better synergy, right? A more optimal synergy, a more effective synchronization between the economic goals and Office of Innovation or Department of Innovation, or however it may be called. Part of what you should do is that the ministers, all the ministries and all the departments and all the agencies responsible for, collaborating, ensuring effective collaboration to ensure that all the inventive activities in the nation translate into economic growth should have a portion of their performance goals tied to the synchronization. In other words, no matter how well you appear to do in education, if education is not for the sake of education, but for the sake of national development, like Daniel Adebiyi would talk about on Thursday, then you have to ensure that you are measuring the Minister of Education, not just by how well educational reforms appear to be going, but how well educational reforms are driving economic development. Does that make sense? Are driving national development. Similarly, as the officer, as the minister, as the secretary, with the responsibility for innovation, you cannot measure me, right, by only how many patents get filed. Well, that can be part of my KPIs. That should be part of my KPIs, but that cannot be the only KPI. As a matter of fact, how much of those intellectual patents are driving economic growth should be another significant portion of my performance evaluation. How much of the economic growth in a nation is tied to innovation is a critical part of this. Now we are talking planning here. Right? I know some nations have the Office of National Planning. They go by different designations in different nations. But even at the level of planning at the beginning of the year, in the last 2 weeks, we've looked at Indonesia, we've looked at China. At the level of planning, at the level of national planning, this synchronization must be, set in place. The framework for synchronization must be set in place at that level. Remember, today we are looking at a topic to wrap up all of our conversations, and that topic is going to lay the framework for implementation, right? We said creating a framework for driving economic growth and innovation, the performance management way. And it's about ensuring that all of the policies that are supposed to, that are supposed to drive economic growth and innovation actually get translated into implementation. I repeat, this is about determining, guaranteeing that all the policies that we've advocated for in the last 3 months, that we've talked about, that we've recommended, that we've proposed, they actually make it to the point of implementation, right? Because if you lay all of those policies in place, if you manage to articulate all of those policies, right, if a nation manages to articulate them, they will not necessarily get to the point of implementation by themselves. One of the things that drives implementation strongly is performance evaluation. I don't know if you've heard this expression that what doesn't get measured does not get done. Very, very important. I repeat, what doesn't get measured does not get done. So if as a nation, you are truly going to be implementing or ensuring that innovation drives economic growth, then you have to translate it into performance goals from the level of planning and also at the point of evaluation. Very, very, very important. Monitoring evaluation is going to be very critical, and part of the things to be monitored at the different levels of the MDAs, and the level of the different MDAs, the ministries, departments, and agencies, is the effectiveness with synchronization. How well is the Ministry of Education working with the Office of Innovation to ensure that the educational curricula, like we've been advocating for in the last 2 quarters, the educational curricula is designed towards synthesis, right? Is designed towards synergy. Last week, we talked about ensuring that even from the level of early childhood education, we're already teaching scientists to think in terms of social sciences and vice versa. Because if you're not careful, what happens is that sometimes the inventiveness, the creators, the technology creators are not thinking of user adoption, market penetration. Now, those are the factors that translate into economic growth. There is no point being a technology developer if you cannot ensure that the market takes up what you are presenting to the market. I was speaking with someone last week. She's an IT specialist. She's done a lot with software. A young, brilliant lady. Hopefully, she would you'll be meeting her more soon. She was talking about, she was asking me a question, and she was saying, why is it that sometimes in some nations, the softwares that get created are not as accepted as the ones that are brought in by foreign nations? And I said to her, because of the lack of synergy. So when you have a nation where this understanding of the market is promoted, even from the level of technology development, they are more likely, such nations are more likely to penetrate the market, because even when they are creating a technology, they are embedding it with user preferences. So in such nations, an understanding of the factors that drive user adoption is built into technology creation, because they have not just raised scientists who think technology alone, but they are raising scientists who are already thinking of market penetration. Again, during the last 1 week, I was listening to some kind of a webinar from, I think it was Sweden or Finland, from a Scandinavian country. Now, this Scandinavian country is top in AI. They were talking beyond robotics about what they called, I think they call it animotics. I don't know if I'm getting the name correctly. Basically, they are already creating, they were saying that the world is used to robots. The world is used to robots that, clean. If you're in a store, the world is used to robots that, would sense where you're coming close and move, and so on and so forth. But they're already talking about creating robots that will think intelligently like human beings. Now, of course, if you've been following artificial intelligence, this is a stronger conversation these days, right? I was reading, even after listening to that webinar, just in the last 24 hours or so, I was still reading about another artificial intelligence company saying that they can create an artificial intelligence machine that would match the level of whose intellect will match the level of a PhD holder. And to be honest with you, I can't tell you it's not possible, right? That is what innovation is about. Innovation is about thinking about what looks impossible and creating it. But the difference between this Scandinavian nation I was talking about, and they also admitted it in the webinar. The difference between them and a nation like America is that they do not think, now capitalism has its excesses, I need to warn about that, but they do not think as capitalistically as a nation like the United States. If such a creation is happening in the United States, believe me, they are already thinking about how to monetize it to the optimal. Do you understand? They're already thinking about that connection between their invention and the market. But in this Scandinavian country, the creators of this product were saying that even though they are the ones leading, apparently they are the ones leading in this invention, the invention of this robotics that can think like human beings, that unfortunately they have not found a path to monetize it as much as the United States tends to do with their own inventions more quickly. Now, what have we been saying on this program? What have we been advocating for on Amogate generally? We have been saying that at the level of policy, that synchronization needs to begin with early child education. I spoke a lot about it last week. From the early child education, that the role of the overall leadership is to begin to say, look, the Ministry of Education must collaborate with the Office of Innovation and collaborate with the Ministry of Economic Planning to ensure that this thinking and enable us make the best of our inventions is built into early childhood education. Let me give you a practical dimension of this. I think many years ago, this was at least 11 years ago, 2014, if I'm not wrong, I used to have a program called Every Child. Every Child is coming back on our own platform, but then it was on another platform. We didn't have Amoge Radio Communications then, and we're not thinking of Amoge Television, which will be starting soon by God's grace, more fully. We're not thinking about Amoge Television then. So we used to have Every Child on radio, on another radio platform, and another TV platform. And on one of the TV sessions of Every Child, I remember speaking to Mr. Biola Fajimi, who runs PML Advisory, a financial advisory firm. He used to work in KPMG Nigeria. He came together with some of his ex-workers and they formed PML Advisory. And the program was raising children to be entrepreneurial. I'm talking 11 years ago. So these things, and Every Child, by the way, is an Amoge production. If you want to watch that episode, you can check it out online, Raising Children, Raising Every Child to be Entrepreneurial. We're saying then, and how do we raise children to be entrepreneurial? So this conversation is something that is not new to us now again. We need to start from early childhood education. We need to build an entrepreneurship mindset. I know some episodes ago on this program, I was also reading research, sharing as part of preparing for this program, I was reading research that already stated that nations that think entrepreneurially, and when we talked about commercialization of innovation, they measured nations that think entrepreneurially and nations that imbue entrepreneurship education into their curriculum. They compared them with nations that don't, I don't incorporate this entrepreneurship orientation into education. And of course, they found that when they did their comparison, they found that nations that embed entrepreneurship education into education as early as possible tend to achieve technology commercialization much, much easily, right, compared to the other ones. And I'm not saying that it's still a walk in the park, but they tend to achieve it much more easily than the nations who don't embed entrepreneurship education, entrepreneurship orientation into their education. So back to the issue of performance management and performance goals. As the president of the country, as the prime minister of the country, once you know that these factors are important, you must ensure that synchronization, for instance, between the Ministry of Education and the Office of Innovation and the Minister in charge of Economic Planning, that synchronization is made a matter of performance evaluation. And it begins with the goal setting, the performance goal setting. Once you are having those executive meetings, those cabinet meetings, like I was saying last week, and you are setting the goals either at the beginning of a year, or at the beginning of a 3-year period, or at the beginning of a 4-year period, or even at the beginning of a quarter, or at the beginning of half year 2, when you're reviewing those goals, it's important to say, look, a certain percentage of your performance score depends on synchronization, because what does not get measured does not matter. It's as simple as that. What does not get measured does not get done. You need to let them know that since education is not it's not just for the sake of education, education is to drive innovation, innovation is to drive economic growth, then it is very important that the synchronization as the overall head of the Ministry of Education, as the overall head of the Office of Innovation, as the overall head of the Ministry of Economic Planning, that reports to me as the president, part of your responsibility is to facilitate, to ensure as effective a collaboration as possible. And there should be clear indicators, performance indicators, measuring the effectiveness of that collaboration. Again, let's talk about, let's backtrack this to even the level of recruitment. Remember, we are looking at today the issue of developing a framework, creating a framework for DEGRI, creating a framework for driving economic growth with innovation. And we're saying the performance management way needs to be in focus. But performance management is also something that is dependent on the quality of personnel that you have, right? So when you're recruiting, you have to recruit people who can do the job. And when you recruit people who can do the job, is because you are clear about the performance expectations, right? Again, this is still the performance management way. Before you recruit at all, there should be clear goals for that role. These are the goals I'm expecting this role to be able to deliver. If you cannot deliver on these goals, then you cannot function in this role. I repeat, if you cannot deliver on this role as a Minister of Education, as the Minister of Economic Planning, as the head of the Office of National Innovation, if you cannot deliver on these goals, then you cannot fit that role. Is still the performance management way. Don't forget that as Amogate, even as far back as 2013, we implemented a review of the performance management framework for a state judiciary in Nigeria. So we are not talking what we have not done. We are not just talking. We are speaking about things we have worked with before. We know how to translate even the most nebulous of themes into clear, measurable indicators. Very, very important, right? I remember our framework is SOM, S-O-M, must be specific, it must be observable, and it must be measurable. So even the most nebulous of themes like justice, we translated this, we worked with 13 pilot courts in the Kaduna State Judiciary in Nigeria, West Africa, as far back as 2013. We did this from 2013 to 2014 as Amogate, and we knew how to work with the judges. We worked with 13 pilot courts, we worked with the state judiciary, and we took the most seemingly the most seemingly intangible of things like justice, like equity, like fairness, and we began to translate into things like the number of reports, the number of complaints filed about poor or unfair judgment, the number of cases that were filed in arbitration, especially those that went from, for instance, the court to arbitration, and so on and so forth. So there are so many ways to translate these things into performance indicators. One thing to take away from today is that it must be measured. The level of synchronization, the effectiveness of synchronization between Ministry of Education and the Office in charge of National Innovation must be measured. The effectiveness of that collaboration must be measured. The same thing between the Office of Ministry or the Ministry of Economic Planning and the Office of National Innovation. The effectiveness must be measured. It must be measured through things like how much of GDP can be attributed to innovations. It must be measured by things like how much of GDP per capita is tied to innovation. It must be measured by things like how much of new market penetrations is tied to innovation, especially on the international market, right? These things can, should, and must be measured. And like I will always say, this is where we come in Amogate. Please call us. We can collaborate with you to build performance frameworks to ensure that there is a measurement of the effectiveness of synchronization between the offices responsible for national innovation and those directly responsible for economic growth, because ultimately all the ministries, all the departments, and all the agencies are responsible for economic and social development. They just have different roles to play in it. Everything should and must be tied to economic and social development. We can no longer educate in a limbo. We can no longer educate in a vacuum. Education must be for the sake of national development. Innovation must be for the sake of economic growth and development. And ditto health also must be targeted towards social development. There must be outcomes and clear outcomes leading to a desired impact. And these things must be clearly stated ab initio. If you don't lay the performance management framework and tie it clearly and also attribute a certain portion of performance evaluation to this synchronization, then it is not going to happen, because what does not get measured does not get done. Don't forget, it is very, very important as the heads of nations to begin to tie clear and predefined amounts or percentages of the performance evaluation scores of the ministers and secretaries of these departments and ministries to the effectiveness of the synchronization, the effectiveness of the synergy as clearly measured, by certain key performance indicators. My name again is Tolu Modara. This is Amoge Radio Communication. This is Driving Economic Growth with Innovation, the very final edition of the program on this last Tuesday of the month of June, and also the last Tuesday of the second quarter of 2025, as well as the last Tuesday of half year one, 2025. Again, we are closing this program by looking at the topic, creating a framework for driving economic growth innovation, creating a framework for DEGRI, right? DEGRI, of course, is the acronym for driving economic growth with innovation, creating a framework for driving economic growth with innovation, the performance management way. Now, let's look at one or two more things and we begin to wrap it up for today and also for the quarter. The first thing to look at is, when you talk about planning, remember I said it is the overall plans that are set, that are translated into performance goals, right? And performance goals, of course, should be also cascaded into performance indicators. Now, when you talk about planning, where does planning begin? This is where we have to go back to last week and 2 weeks ago. The planning, of course, should be driven by the overall leadership. The overall leadership has the accountability, not just the responsibility, but the accountability for the planning. Vision, remember what we said, vision, but it also begins with thinking, the analysis, especially looking at your current situation analysis, very, very important. Last week, we talked about setting, for instance, goals in the areas of your comparative strength. You could also set goals in the areas of your comparative weaknesses, but it's all back to the vision of the overall leader. Of course, a good leader would learn to co-create. An effective leader would never try to build all by him or herself. In Amoge's the principle of co-creation is very strong for us because people would never tend to burn a picture they are a part of. They will never, throw that picture, the photograph into the fire. Anything that they're a part of, they don't want to, destroy because they had their own input. So we are always big on co-creation. But much as the responsibility is a shared one, the accountability, the overall accountability for setting the strategic direction, the policy direction for the nation belongs to the overall leader. But of course, in making this a shared responsibility, right, one of the things that leaders, we strongly believe, need to do is to ensure that everyone sees their piece of the cake. Let me explain. So imagine that the goals, the national goals, the economic goals, the social development goals, of the nation as translated into health indicators, economic indicators, right? Imagine that it's a big cake that we all have to bake. That cake, part of it will be the flour, part of it will be the sugar, part of it will be the eggs, part of it, you get my point? And I can go on and on. Now, everyone has what they bring to the cake. Everyone has something. But you see, I'm not going to eat the eggs alone and that is cake. You are not going to eat the flour alone and that is cake. You are not going to eat the sugar alone and that is cake. It's when we bring all these elements together that we bake a beautiful cake. And by the time we eat the cake, it's a cake that we all have baked.